Morning, I'm mckay and today we're going to be taking a look at The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This one was first published in 1967 and I suppose technically it is a young adult novel, but I use that term very, very reluctantly, mainly because I don't like the association with it in modern day standards. But technically, I'd say it's a coming of age novel overall, and yes, it features teenagers primarily. There's actually very little adult characters in the novel. And yeah, fuck the adult fiction thing. It doesn't really, or the young adult fiction thing, it doesn't really apply, I don't think, because a lot of people will call like Catcher in the Rye nowadays a young adult novel. And yes, it's the story of a teenager, but I don't know, for me it doesn't really work that much. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really see the difference that much. But this is written from the perspective of a 14-year-old boy called Pony Boy, that is his literal name, and he's got two brothers, one of them called Soda Pop, who that's his literal name as well, and Darry, who's the eldest, and they've lost their parents and they basically live in the house because of Darry and the fact that he works and he can, because he's 20, I think he's old enough to be the kind of guardian or supervisor or whatever you want to call it. So they actually do live together. And I'd say the novel overall tells a story of a kind of coming of age theme, but really it's about the loss of innocence. And I think that that is a theme that really works on many levels, and I don't think it is actually exclusive to teenagers or to young adults personally. I think you can go through different stages of losing innocence, and what Ponyboy has to go through is quite traumatic, not to mention the fact that his parents are dead, and you don't really hear much about them apart from that they died in a car accident, I think. But you don't really hear what he really thinks of them, or you get very little information about them anyway. And I thought that was a clever choice by Hinton, because she deliberately avoided that, I think, to focus on the teenage element of it. And I suppose one of the other major themes in it is the kind of west-east divide, because Ponyboy belongs to a group called the Greasers, and they're the kind of poor working class, never really have many opportunities kind of types. And they're in kind of a gang war against the socias, or the socials, and they're the rich kids, you know, the trust fund babies, I suppose we'd know them in nowadays terms. But whilst this does play quite a big theme, and it's done very well, it's nothing new. That's the only thing I found about it. It's, you know, Shakespeare tackled that back in Romeo and Juliet, so you don't really, whilst I can see an easy nod, and whilst it does still work, because it is kind of about the effect that their stupid kind of rivalry has on the kind of friendships and relationships that they all have. And it does feed into the kind of coming of age element of the fact that they realise that they're just like them in a lot of ways, and although the socials might have better opportunities in some regards, they still have their own problems and their own kind of social requirements that they need to meet and all of those kind of things. But I suppose what really kind of surprised me, I suppose I went into it with no real knowledge of it apart from I'd heard of it. There's a film by Francis Ford Coppola as well. I think that was filmed about 15 years after its release. And Hinton actually stars in it as a nurse as well, which is interesting. I'm going to be watching the film pretty soon, possibly tonight. Mainly because it has all these actors in it as well. I think Tom Cruise is in it, Ralph Macchio, the Karate Kid, is in it, Patrick Swayze. It's got all these dudes, so I'm quite surprised I haven't heard of the film before. I suppose because of its age that I haven't got into it. But I've heard it's pretty good, so I think it'll be worth checking out. And overall, I just think the novel's actually, what it does really well is actually makes you emotionally invested, and it kind of really invites you to become part of the story, I suppose, because you're reading it through the perspective of Ponyboy, who uses a very kind of American working class vernacular, that if English is your second language, I would say you might struggle with that a little bit. You'd have to get used to the vernacular. So I reckon you'd want to look it up on a Cliff Notes kind of thing, so you can actually see what certain phrases mean. But there isn't many, and I think it would be easy enough to get into, because I actually found at the beginning I took a little while to get used to all the character names, because there's quite a lot of them, and because they are bizarre, like Soda Pop and 2-Bit and Dallas and stuff like that. So it takes you a little while to get used to all those kind of pet names that many gangs have, and a lot of kids use those kind of shortened names and ways of relating to each other in a kind of very personal sense, which really gives a kind of truthful element to it. Because although it does get really violent towards the latter stages of the novel, which kind of took me by surprise, but probably shouldn't have done considering what Ponyboy talks about at the beginning, it's actually it's still quite shocking in some ways, because yeah, you kind of hear about kids, shit talking and all that kind of stuff, but you never really take it that seriously. But when it does actually happen, I was kind of almost tempted to reread the page, thinking, did that just go down? Because it's actually done very quickly a lot of the time. Hinton wastes no time kind of getting to the next plot point, or to the next stage. And I think she done that in a very skilled way, actually. And I was surprised that it was written by a woman, I have to admit, because I had no idea when I was reading it. And then as I've done a little bit of research to find out that, one, she wasn't, to find out that A, not only was she a woman, but B, she was 15 when she started writing it, and I think it was published when she was 17 or possibly 18. So she worked on it for a year and a half before a publisher decided to put it out there. And I think what impressed me with that the most is how masculine it is and how macho. And although Ponyboy is a sensitive kind of character in ways, and there are other characters in it that do definitely represent a kind of more sensitive nature, you could say feminine, but I'd say that's probably the wrong word. It's more the fact that she really gets it right with that kind of mentality at that age, and this kind of black and white way of looking at the world, and of right and wrong, and of West and East kind of classes. So it has a kind of nice use of colour actually throughout it, where she describes, or Ponyboy, through Ponyboy's voice, she describes like the eyes of a lot of characters and how they either appear menacing or inviting. And a lot of the time that will divide the classes, but also it adds a colour to the whole theme, which is what a lot of the characters actually miss quite a lot of the time. They see it as a black and white filter a lot of the time, but really there's a vibrancy to the whole thing, and it is very alive. And I would say it really captures childhood, or at least that era of childhood, when you're kind of in that puberty, basically, when you're in that kind of stage and your hormones are kind of all over the place, but you're also confused and you don't really know what the hell's going on. And if you do grow up poor, or at least know quite a lot of people who do grow up in that way or in poverty, you'll definitely relate to a lot of it, despite the later violence that is included. Because that's what I actually found was the most touching of the novel overall, was really seeing myself at that age and being some scared shitless kid, but trying to act as if nothing bothered me, and had to have this kind of fake or faux stoicism when trying to face the world that is utterly terrifying. So really, I actually found it to be quite touching in that regard. And there is another character called Johnny, who's another kind of sensitive one, and he's easily the most sensitive, and I felt very sorry for him despite everything that happens and what he does overall, which I do think is a credit to Hinton again, because it's what he does is kind of partly illogical but also very relatable and understandable. And because this Johnny Cakes has very little love in his life and only really gets it from the gang that he's involved in, and the fact that his parents couldn't give two shits about him, really does make you feel for him quite a lot. And I just thought it was beautifully depicted and very impressive for someone, because I was trying to decide this, because is it impressive that someone could write something that's so true and that's so gritty in its realism if they do it from the age of 15? And also because it's easier to do in a way, because you can kind of forgive the grammatical mistakes where it uses bad wordage, for example, but because that actually fits the vernacular and the social class of the protagonist, then it is forgivable. So I'm not really sure if it is to her credit, or was it just easier because she was that age at the same time? But because she was female and probably only had a kind of outside view, ironically, it being the outsiders of this group, I'd say it's definitely commendable overall. I was quite like, wow, she really depicted this kind of these groups very, very well. And I think she got the idea or was encouraged by her father. So I don't know whether it was one of her father's stories from his youth, or because it is written in the time that it was released. So it was kind of I think it was 1960s Oklahoma. And yeah, overall, I was very impressed. I was quite moved by it, actually, because it has a kind of Catcher in the Rye meets The Body by Stephen King vibe, where it's kind of very American of that kind of era. The kids have this kind of way of speaking to each other, this slang kind of you've got to be part of the gang or otherwise you're an outsider, but really everyone's an outsider because they're trying to figure everything out. And it's got this kind of warm-heartedness, even nostalgic kind of tone that I've always really liked, to be honest. I do think there is something with coming-of-age novels and with themes where there is a loss of innocence. Again, I don't think that is exclusive to teenagers. I do think you can actually go through different stages of your life, and although it probably does get darker and darker as it goes on and probably more depressing, there is a beauty to it as well. There is something about possibly trying to hold on to it in some way, or to at least look at the world through those eyes every now and again, just to remember that despite all your problems, everyone else has them. And I think that was the kind of overall message at the end of it. And I don't think that is only reserved for young people, to be honest. I think you will go through similar stages in your life, mainly because social environments don't change that much. You still have, if you work in an office environment in your early 30s or 40s or whatever, you're still going to get the same bullshit political dynamics and social games that people play. And when people say that, there might be a more mature outlook to it and people might not take it as seriously, but it's still there. I don't think that ever really goes away. And in some ways, it just gets darker and tougher as you get older, and you're not really allowed to bitch about it, because then you're viewed as, someone who's childish, I would say. There is a kind of, I think that's also why a lot of adults actually really relate to this novel, because it's not just remembering what it's like to go back there. Actually, it reminds me, there is a kind of a small bit where Ponyboy is trying not to remember what's happened, and he kind of gets a bit delirious as it goes on. And then towards the end, he's actually trying to remember it. So it's actually kind of like there is a kind of realization that it's important to try and learn from what you experience, rather than just block it out, no matter how dark and upsetting it may be. So there is part of it that's really dark and quite shocking, and it was quite controversial in its day. And I think there's still some places in America that they don't teach it, but for the majority part, I'm pretty sure they teach it in schools quite a lot. And I think they should. And it actually does remind me of, like, say, the film Joker, that has been a massive success and was strongly about the kind of socio-economic divide between people, and how, the view of mental illness and of people who don't quite fit in is something that isn't really being addressed nowadays. And I do think that's always been a problem. And there is a call for more books and possibly movie adaptations of these kind of themes, especially now when there is such a massive divide between the rich and poor. So I have a kind of, I won't, hope with a bated breath for this to come out, but I do think that there's definitely room for a kind of resurgence of these types of novels and movies, because if there was ever a time for them, now is it, I would say. But alas, I do think it's difficult nowadays as well, with the technological advances make it very tricky to kind of draw the line of differences, because everything is so complex, really. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on this, to be honest. I think if you're looking for a quick read, this will probably take you about 4 or 5 hours to get through, so you could do it in one sitting. It does get very moving as it goes on, which surprised me. I actually thought it was going to get, I don't know, I thought it was going to take some different turns at moments. And although I found the ending to be slightly predictable, it was still very satisfactory in a way. And I quite liked the fact that although it was a bit obvious, especially with Ponyboy's kind of academic prowess, you could kind of see it coming, but it was satisfactory nonetheless, kind of thing. It was a kind of a realization of who he is, I suppose, I would say, at the end, and of him accepting the fact that he isn't stupid, and the only way he's going to prove himself to be stupid is to carry on doing what he's doing. And if he actually, knuckles down, or puts his knuckles down rather, and concentrates on his kind of studies, then he'll be able to get outside of this kind of gang mentality, which I guess is the message overall. But also there is an inclusion of a Robert Frost poem about gold, but that's the shit way of describing it, to be honest. It's more about kind of seeing the world and seeing the gold that's there, not in the metallic sense, but in the kind of, in the beauty of sunsets kind of thing, or in the beauty of life in general, I suppose, and of trying not to forget that no matter how grim things get. It's important to try and hold on to kind of some degree of hope, or at least the majestic element of life, I suppose, or the kind of the things that aren't understandable but are at the same time still things that can make you feel awe, I would say. And of the fact that it isn't all just about you, in a way. It's more like there is a connection between things, and if you can still hold on to that, no matter what life throws at you, then I think you're going to be fine overall. I say that. The older you get, the worse life gets. That seems to be very true. If you really look at aging, it's not fucking great, is it? But for the majority of life, it should be all right, I suppose, overall. Fucking hell, I'm getting grim here. But yeah, overall, I would say this is a good one. Yeah, check it out. It's hard for me to really big it up, because it's not, it's not a literary masterpiece or anything like that. It's actually quite an easy read. I think the messages in it, though strong, are a little bit obvious at times and have been done to death, especially now. But at the same time, it's quite refreshing to read something that doesn't really preach at you. There isn't any judgment in it. And I thought Hinton's skill with it was actually very, very good overall. It was kind of like you got used to the style, and although it deviated from it very slightly as it got into a more kind of poignant kind of phase, it did it very majestically, I would say, and it did it in a way that I actually found to be quite moving, and definitely something I think is worth checking out. So if you've read it or if you've seen the film, drop me a comment, let me know what you thought of it. Did you relate to it in any way? I especially did, with the fact that the loneliness a lot of the characters, especially the younger ones, Johnny Cakes and Ponyboy, and they're kind of, although they're trying to be men in a way, or at least tough because of the group that they're associated with, being the greasers. At the same time, there is a kind of a lack of awareness that they sometimes show, but for the majority part, they kind of hide it away for the sake of the gang. And I think anyone who's given into peer pressure can really relate to that. And regardless of what you're taught about that, you're still going to fall victim to it at some point. So in a lot of senses, you will see yourself and people you once knew in a lot of this novel. But I found it interesting that the title of this is The Outsiders. It's almost like, because within the gang, they can't quite see that they are different from each other at times, and things aren't black and white the way a kind of us versus them mentality will show you. So maybe this book is actually more important nowadays, especially with the rising of kind of tribalism that's out there at the moment. I think it's probably important to view the idiocy of becoming part of a group a lot of the time, or how it can blind you, really, because you are literally psychologically more vulnerable to agree amongst a group of people than you are to think for yourself. And I think the underlining message of this book is the fact that you have to kind of know thyself, I suppose, towards the end of anything. It's like if you get caught up in the wrong group of people, or not even necessarily the wrong group of people, but a set of persons that aren't suited to what you want or your kind of goals, then it is about separating yourself from that and becoming the outsider, in a sense. I think that's the overall message, in a way, or at least that's what I took from it. And there might be a few more that you might take from it that I don't, or that I don't see at the moment. I don't know, but there are a few themes throughout it. It's a simplistic read, I would say, overall. And that's probably what does make it adult fiction, or young adult fiction. But whether you put any credence to that, I don't know. That's up to you. I don't really care that much. Genre stuff is bullshit. It's helpful if you're after a certain type of book, I suppose. But I actually think it limits art. And for me, this is just a kind of classic coming of age story that I think everyone should check it out, to be honest. It's a quick read. There's no excuse for not reading it, to be honest. So whenever you've got a spare moment to check it out, I think you should. I'm kind of waffling, so I'm going to go. No more news. The quality of this will improve when I get a camera. That will probably be in a few weeks. I can't see it being any sooner at the moment. But yeah, who knows? Maybe I'll surprise you. But I'm not sure. Thank you very much for watching. I've been mckay. If you would like to support me on Patreon, that would be appreciated. The link is in the description. And yeah, nothing else really. That's it for me this week. I hope you have a good one. See you later.